Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you so much for tuning in to Just Nation. My name is Nia Holston. I am one of the co-hosts of the show, here as always with Reverend Holston and our esteemed panel of guests. We are so excited to talk about what is such a critical and important topic in the city of Philadelphia and beyond, the state of the Philadelphia jails. There's no question, the Philadelphia jails are in crisis, and it is so important to recognize the profound trauma that is happening within those walls. And so our guests today are going to talk specifically about what are the Philly jails, what is unique about them, what is similar to other jails across the country, what are some of the problems within the jail, and what all of us need to do to fix it. So with me today, and I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Holston.
Well, Nia, this is a very important topic, and I think one of the reasons people have various different emotions about the Philadelphia jails is they don't really understand that half the people in the jail are simply awaiting trial. I mean, that means that they're innocent until proven guilty. And so many people who have been injured or harmed or hurt in some way in the jail are really there awaiting their opportunity to prove themselves, to share that they are innocent of the charges. We seem to think that people who are criminalized don't have the right to feel protected, to feel safe, to feel that they can deal with that situation in a way that with humanity. And our Philadelphia jails are a constant symbol of the fact that we're not treating our own in a humane way. So I'm excited about our guests today to kind of share a little bit about that and get a little deeper about what we're doing, particularly people of faith who are called to visit those that are in prison. What are we doing to make sure that our jails are humane?
Absolutely. And even beyond that, really talking about the ways in which the prison system and the jail system across this country creates the conditions that ail our communities. And so I do want to correct one statistic, Reverend Holston. You said that over half of the people at the jails are pretrial. It's closer to 90%. And so it's really, really critical that we think about the rights of all people, not just people who are pretrial, not just people who may have been accused of things that we're okay with, but the rights of all people, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what they've done, to have safe conditions outside of walls, to be free from trauma and difficulty, and to be able to thrive outside of prison walls. And so with us today are our guests, and so I'm going to start with my left. Sam Liu is an organizer with the Abolitionist Law Center and is a coworker of mine. And to my right is Medusa Carter, an organizer with Still We Rise, and just a phenomenal activist within the city as well. And so I'm going to start with Sam. If you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to this work, it would be really great.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the show too. I'm from San Francisco, the Bay Area, and I was first really introduced to the carceral system when one of my really, really good friends when we were in high school was incarcerated in our local jail. He had a mental illness, schizophrenia, and after he was incarcerated in the jail, which had really terrible conditions, was one of the worst jails in San Francisco. It was so traumatizing and really changed the trajectory of his life even after release, and he didn't receive the community care prior to his incarceration or following it, and that really got me involved in the fight to not only address human rights violations in jails and prisons, but also work to close them down because they are such sites of violence and danger to everyone in the United States. And then in addition to that, a lot of my work in the past has been organizing people who are experiencing homelessness and so many of the people who are in jails are people who are houseless. And people were being criminalized for things like sitting on the sidewalk, eating a sandwich at the bus stop, sleeping on a bench, and were filling the jails simply because they were criminalized for behaviors that allowed them to survive on a day-to-day basis. And so I think through that work, it really illuminated the fact that, one, our jails were filled with people who were overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly homeless, and overwhelmingly Black and brown for reasons that they were just trying to survive. And that's what has brought me to that work. And then I came to Philly, and I'm now doing anti-jails and anti-solitary confinement work here.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Yeah.
Medusa?
I first started working with political prisoners and fighting to bring our elders home. And then I myself became incarcerated. And when I came home, I realized that a lot of the women and TGNC folks that were incarcerated were there for, defending themselves against an attacker. They were there for, poverty crimes. They were there for, essentially the system kind of railroaded them for being women and TGNC folks, essentially, because some of the same, charges that men would get, they wouldn't get the same kind of time, so they gave them extensive sentences. And so when I came home, I wanted to try to rectify that and to bring some of these folks home, because you lock up mothers and it devastates the community. Our fathers have been going, in the Black community specifically, our fathers have been going to prison for at least the last 2-3 decades. So we're familiar with the fathers being absent. What we're not familiar with is the mothers being absent and the system taking the children away and family reunification becoming almost non-existent when folks return home. So I wanted to get involved, and so I started my work in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I moved to Philadelphia maybe about 5 years ago, and I started my own organization, Mary's Daughter for the Formerly Incarcerated. We did the Dignity Act Now Collective, which was essentially focused on the dignity for incarcerated women in PA. We were able to move that legislation forward. It passed the House unanimously last year. Kind of got caught up in the Senate, but initially we had over 12 different legislators that introduced a piece of legislation to this bill. And so it just opened dialogue about what women are experiencing in those facilities.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for both of you for the work that you do. And I think it's important to talk about, for those who may be familiar, for those who are not familiar, just if folks can give an overview of what the Philly jails are, where they are, what the conditions are like there, things like that. So I'm going to start with Sam, if you would like to do that.
Yeah. So some of the things that people need to know about the jails is that they affect thousands of people on a daily basis. The population is about 4,700 people at any given time across 4 main jails, which are located like all the way up northeast area. And there's about 30,000 people every year who cycle in and out of the jails. So what we're really looking at is like thousands and thousands of Philadelphians who are traumatized and impacted by the local carceral system every single day and every single year. The jails are overwhelmingly male. It's about 93% of the population. And as you were mentioning before, overwhelmingly have not been convicted of any crimes or awaiting trial. So that's 90% of people. And they are sites of violence. The conditions are really horrible, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. The other thing I wanted to just touch base on briefly is also like the history, like the past 8 years where we've seen a pretty big reduction in the population of the Philly jails. So there's been about a 42% reduction in the jail That's almost half. And I think when people, if they heard like, oh, we're gonna reduce half of the jail's population, a lot of people would be like, wow, that's a lot of people. I feel unsafe. I don't want that to happen. But the reality is that has happened already, and in a relatively short amount of time. And at the same time, there has been no real correlation in the amount of, in the crime rates. And what we're actually seeing is in the past couple of years, violent crime has decreased. And so oftentimes I think there is this idea that if there are more people in the jail or the jail system is a lot more robust, we're gonna see crime rates drop and that our communities will be safer. But in reality, we can, it's a really powerful way to illustrate that, look, we are currently decreasing and have decreased the population by so much, and crime hasn't gone up. And I think that's something, that's like a big myth that people need to understand.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to add something here and to talk about what the population looks like, right? Mm-hmm. And I should also state that I am an attorney with the Abolitionist Law Center. I have done work, filed lawsuits against the Philadelphia jails in the city of Philadelphia for conditions of confinement. I'm speaking on my own behalf, just like everyone else is here today. I think that it's important to talk about, so people are awaiting trial and what that means. So when people are incarcerated in the Philly jails, it may be because they have been charged with a crime. It may be because they may have been convicted of a crime, and then they were sentenced to probation, and there was some sort of alleged probation violation that resulted in a detainer, what's known as a detainer. And so a person can be sitting in jail for either what's a technical violation or a direct violation of a probation sentence. And that can include a new offense, a new alleged offense, that can include not following the supposed conditions of probation. Individuals can also be incarcerated for what are called county sentences. And so that includes people who were sentenced in court to less than what is typically 11 and a half to 23 months of incarceration. And that means that they would stay in the Philadelphia jail system as opposed to going upstate or into the state prison system. And so we're really talking about a wide range of folks who are coming in. Jails, rather than prisons, are places where people are often cycling in and out, as Sam said. So there's a lot more volatility in terms of who's there and what the conditions look like. And Medusa, you spoke so eloquently about the work that you do for incarcerated women and TGNC folks. And it's so important to also keep them a part of this conversation as well. And so I'm so glad that you're here today with us. So I just want to talk a little bit about, and Medusa, if you want to share anything on this topic, please feel free, if anything on this topic that we've said.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Oh, yeah, if you want to just give an overview of the jails.
So what's happening specifically in the women's facility is that we're seeing mothers being shackled during childbirth. We're seeing the lack of adequate hygiene items, the lack of gynecological care. We're seeing mental illness at an all-time high. We're seeing trans folks being placed in solitary confinement for quote unquote their own safety. We're seeing mothers that are being ripped apart from their families. We're seeing that even when you give birth in jail, that they take your child immediately, so you don't even get that skin-to-skin contact, that very human thing that you do for dogs even. So we're seeing that they take those children away. We're seeing family reunification falling by the wayside. Mothers, if you are just sitting in jail pre-trial and you've been there for 13 months It's almost irrevocable for you to get your children back unless you have a lawyer to fight to get them back, even if you haven't been convicted of any crime. So you're seeing folks coming out trying to get their children back, but they're caught up in family court. They're caught up in trying to get their housing back, get their employment, so it just disrupts an entire ecosystem. It disrupts a community, it disrupts families. It's just very disruptive, especially when you're talking about pretrial, when you're talking about county, when these people are not actually, you're not going for a long sentence, you're not going for, most people in county jail are doing 2 years, maybe 3 at the most, but you're not really doing a lot of time in the county jail. So what you're seeing is like people, failure to appear in court for a traffic warrant, things that are not harmful to society and to your community. You're seeing people become incarcerated and being harmed in jail. Like, it's not a safe place, it's volatile, and especially in Philly jails where they're understaffed. And so you have maybe about the capacity to hold about 300 women and TGNC folks in the women facility. And because mass incarceration tends to be about men, right, that there's no services that are particular for the women. They're just locking them in these facilities that are inhumane and not actually dealing with what they're going through. 90% of these women who become incarcerated have experienced some form of trauma prior to their incarceration. So we're seeing like the mental illness and trauma going untreated. But the main thing that I want to mention is that they will, give you a psychotropic. They won't give you therapeutic support, but they will give you a psychotropic. They will drug you up. They will give you whatever you ask for. And even if you don't ask for it, if you complain, even if you're like suicidal or having any type of, mental breakdown, their prescription is to give you a psychotropic and to send you on your way. Not even like you're supposed to get mental therapeutic support with the psychotropic, and that's not happening, especially in Philly jails.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you touched on so much there. I would love to talk about how the pandemic impacted a lot of this. And so in my previous career, I was a public defender. And so some of the things that I was a public defender at the start of the pandemic. And, my fear was, and I think many people came to realize this, is that when the pandemic started, so much of the social support system was taken away. When the pandemic was raging and ongoing, the court system came to basically a standstill. And what that meant were that people made efforts, attorneys made efforts, and activists made efforts to free as many people as possible, but it meant that many people were still incarcerated for long periods of time and were not able to have their day in court that in a timely manner that is fashioned by law. And so many people, especially in 2020 and the early parts of 2021, were locked up on accusations, and where you're supposed to have a preliminary hearing within a certain amount of days. In 2020, many people's preliminary hearings would be rescheduled, and then rescheduled, and then rescheduled, and then rescheduled. And so even as an attorney meeting with clients, I could not give them a real sense of when they would have their day in court to address their concerns. And so meanwhile, I'm looking at folks just like we all have, who are experiencing terrible conditions, who are not getting access to showers, are calling me screaming and crying because of the difficulties that they're experiencing. And the word difficulty doesn't even begin to cover it, the torture that they were experiencing. And I remember looking at being at an animal shelter in the pandemic, and being at a shelter that made sure that the animals got fresh air during the pandemic, and just recognizing the ways in which that was not happening in the city of Philadelphia. And so it really motivated me to want to work towards systemic change, want to do systemic advocacy, because the conditions were so bad. And so you touched on understaffing. Can you share a little bit more about what that meant and how it may have been exacerbated by the pandemic?
Yeah, so because it's also, when you're understaffed, it's also not safe for the COs as well. Like, it's not safe for the COs to be with an influx of folks who are incarcerated, because they're not able to change shifts, they're working more hours, they're tired, they're not getting their adequate, thing for their job, as well as, folks are not being let out their cell. Folks are not being able to go and get their food. Folks are not being able to make phone calls to their families. Folks are not being able to, go and see the medical. Folks are not able to actually do the thing that they need to do to survive. And so even they just locked up a bunch of people to the point where they couldn't even distance. They couldn't do the 6 feet. They were just throwing people in these mass cells, and just having people in these large cells in these really unsafe conditions. And if you complained about, if you had a cough, if you had a thing, it would even exacerbate the whole situation. So many people had it and did not say anything. Because now what's this going to do? Am I getting in solitary confinement? Am I going to whatever? Are you actually going to treat it? Like, what is the, what actually happens? And for a minute, they didn't have access to the vaccine. And then it became a thing to get the vaccine. At one point, they were like giving out sandwiches to take the vaccine, which also made people, and it was a thing. Like, if you weren't vaccinated, you couldn't have visitation. You couldn't get a phone call. You can make a phone call. If you weren't vaccinated. So then it became like, oh man, is this some ploy? Is this some conspiracy that I have to get the vaccine? And so it was really horrendous. And then the people, they did let a lot of people out, but then folks who were on detainers, because even the Philadelphia Bail Fund was bailing people out. They had got a lot of donations to bail people out, but folks on detainers were not able to come home. And so it could be a small violation. It could be like someone called the cops and I happened to be in the place. I didn't commit a crime, but someone called the cops and I was there. And so now I'm violating my parole, or I'm violating my probation, and I'm on this detainer for months on end, and I can't even see my judge. So so that's some of what folks were dealing with during the pandemic. And again, you see the system, because they were understaffed, again, there's no way to get you to medical. There's no way, even if you did have the symptoms, even if you did have it, how am I getting you to medical on time? I'm not sure of the numbers of folks who did contract it. I'm not sure of the number of folks who actually passed away, because they lock elders up too. So those folks who were, had immunodeficiencies or any type of disorder or whatever, like we're seeing that the elders were also impacted even more in the Philly jails.
Absolutely, absolutely. And let's be clear here. We're talking about the pandemic and the intersection between some of these issues, but the city of Philadelphia has a responsibility for the people that they keep in their custody, that they keep in their jails, to provide for their medical care, to provide for their human rights, right? And there have been many people, correctional officers, incarcerated folks, advocates, who have detailed incredibly, in incredible detail, how those rights have been being violated consistently. So and specifically on the issue of understaffing, that issue predated the pandemic as well. And so it's important to talk about the pandemic and the impact that has had, but it's also important to be clear that this is a responsibility regardless. When you're taking people into custody, you have to provide for them. And what has ended up happening is that there have been incredibly high rates of violence in the facilities. It's an incredibly unsafe place to be. There have been a number of jail deaths, including this week, including one person who was only at the jail for 1 day. And his lawyer specifically said he wasn't even supposed to be incarcerated, right? He wasn't even supposed to be incarcerated. He was picked up on a bench warrant, and the court document said bench warrant for service, do not hold, which means he was not supposed to even be at the Philadelphia jails. But he was taken there instead, and he was killed for spending 1 day there. And so there have been incredibly high rates of violence and deaths, not just homicides, but suicides and medical deaths as well. And so we have to talk about this. Those rates have been incredibly high and higher than many jails across the country, right? It's important to note that there's something that's happening specifically within the Philadelphia jails. And so Sam, if you would like to talk about some of the jail deaths and the work that you've done to address some of that.
Yeah, Philadelphia has some of the highest rates of jail deaths in the country. And since 2020, there's been at least 50 people who have died in Philly jails. And the reason why I say at least is because this type of information is incredibly hard to access because the jail is so secretive about what is happening in there and who is dying and the violence that people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, including dying for many, many different reasons. But bottom line, the jails are very, very dangerous and unsafe for the people who are being held there. Just this year alone, was the 13th death this year. And that's 13 people who should not have had to die. Like, all of those deaths were preventable. And as Nia was saying, like, the deaths are they run the gamut, right? Like, there are some people who have died because they're not getting medical care, others who have died because it was a homicide or there was some sort of violence interpersonal violence. But the other thing I want to note is that for the past 10 years, the biggest reason that people have died in the jail is because of suicide. And I want to note that because I think it shows how horrific the conditions and the traumatic experience of being in the Philly jails is. Not just right now during the pandemic, but for years and years on end. And being in a cell in and of itself, a lot of times in some sort of segregated isolation, whether or not they call it solitary confinement is another matter, is so damaging and deteriorating for people who are inside. And, we were talking about staffing and how the jails are so understaffed. That is something that the workers inside are also pushing for. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Correctional Officers Union and the social workers came out with a statement that said, we need to decarcerate the jails because it is understaffed and because it is dangerous for both the workers and incarcerated people. And that still holds true. It's going to take a long, long, long time to actually staff up to any sort of level. And even at regular or sufficient staffing levels, we know that prisons and jails are inherently dangerous and violent. And so one of the things I think we all really push to address and prevent deaths from happening is to get people out of such a dangerous situation.
Absolutely.
Yes. So the reality then is really this has been a long-term problem way before the pandemic. It's been under court order around overcrowding since the early 1970s and safety issues around it since the 1970s. My brief term as doing some legal work, I represented a family who an individual was killed in prison. Another prisoner had literally taken a piece of the prison infrastructure, dug it out from the dirt, a piece of metal, sharpened it, and stabbed him and killed him. And that was in the 1980s. So it's been long-term, many deaths every year for over the last 50 years. And each time someone supposedly comes and says they're going to try to solve the problem, the next commissioner comes and says they're going to address the issues. The issues never get addressed. And as soon as they build a new prison, it is immediately antiquated for the needs of the time. So you had the same issues rising over and over and over again. It should be noted as well that the high of about 10,000 in the jails around 2013, that in the 1970s it was considered overcrowded, and the numbers were about 80% less in terms of people incarcerated. So your point earlier about can we actually have less people actually in the jail? Well, we did. Before mass incarceration, 80% less people. And Philadelphia had a bigger population then. And so we have managed in the past, but because we incarcerate people on so many different things now, because of the explosion of the drug war, of the supposedly war on drugs, it was really a war on black and brown people, that has expanded the number of people that are in these jails and are being held in these jails. And we don't have to continue to do that. We can reduce those numbers greatly. And we have in the past, and we can do it in the future.
And specifically, not only can we do it, and not only is the jail population still comparatively high compared to other jurisdictions
and other nations.
We have to do it. We have to do it. People are suffering right now. The Philadelphia jails are just simply not equipped. Even if you're not coming from an abolitionist perspective, they're just simply not equipped to handle the amount of people that are in those jails right now.
But I think a real big point of that is so that people out here don't feel afraid, and they shouldn't feel afraid, is that this increase, again, 80% of this increase is about stuff that really is about public health. Addiction issues, about public health, mental health, that's public health issues. When you go to Bucks County, and I pastored there 20 years ago, first week I was there, individual in the church had an addiction issue, so I went down to the court to see about him. They told me he wasn't there. I said, where is he at? He's at the hospital. Because we take people who are dealing with addiction issues and we immediately send them to the hospital to give them the help and support they need. We don't incarcerate them. That was in Bucks County 20 years ago. And we don't have similar facilities today here in the city of Philadelphia where someone who is dealing with addictions issues or mental health issues can immediately, without incarceration, go to these facilities. So we have not done enough to treat issues that are really public health as public health. And the community needs to understand that's what a lot of the issues that are going on in the jails, and the jails are simply not equipped to address them.
And I think another thing, Rev, as we talk about the opioid crisis and those things and these safe injection sites and things that are coming up, because this problem has reached rural areas. But had we had more diversionary programs, had we had more of addressing the systemic issue of addiction, of the crack epidemic, of these different things, we would have had less of a crime rate. Because what you're dealing with, people are traumatized. People are traumatized and they're turning to drugs to try to self-soothe their issues. And instead of actually addressing what's causing these systemic issues, their answer was to over-police them, to essentially militarize the police state and come in. And I know for me, I have a very visceral reaction to police officers. And it's not just, I'm in the middle of committing a crime, so I'm scared, but it's like just seeing your presence, your overbearing presence brings, high anxiety. So I may even say something more than I would normally say to a person. If you would have been like, hey, could you move your car, please? Versus, hey, you need to, you know what I mean? Like just the way that you react, just the way that you talk to people can exasperate any trauma that they've experienced. And so we see that there's more of it's more of a public health issue when it comes to opioids, as opposed to the crack epidemic that I think devastated the black and brown communities of the 80s.
And
which
it should have been a public health issue
Right.
addressing the crack, but it was not.
Right.
We incarcerated. And
Right.
that has led to much of this population explosion. Excuse me for interrupting.
No problem. And then specifically when you talk about the women in TG&C folks who are becoming incarcerated, again, you're talking about folks who are being incarcerated for addictions instead of being rehabilitated, instead of going to diversionary programs, instead of having some sort of assistance in their crisis. Because these are essentially, like I said, victims who are being re-victimized again. Instead of addressing the issue, they're being criminalized for being victims in the first place.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. There's been so much that has been said and shared, and I also think that it's important to note, and I don't think anyone has done this, but you know, when we talk about mass incarceration, it's important to talk about the war on drugs, but we also have to contend with people who have been accused of violence, right? They are also a part of our communities, right? In some cases, they are our loved ones, our friends, right? And so we have to also contend with that as a part of dealing with these issues as well. And I think it's really, really important to note that prisons, specifically from an abolitionist perspective, but just from a logical perspective, they create the conditions for violence. When people are incarcerated and they're experiencing just profound trauma, when they're experiencing those conditions and then coming out into the outside world and not getting the help that they need, to really contend with the mental health trauma, the physical trauma, the financial trauma, what we've talked about, right? We talked about collateral consequences. That term almost sanitizes it, right? These are real harms that are being enacted by the state in a general sense. And so it's really, really important to talk about, if we want safer communities, if we really mean what we say when we want safer communities, then it's not about a ski mask ban that the Philadelphia City Council just passed. It's not about incarcerating more people. It's not about ignoring these traumas. We have to do something about what's happening in the jails every single day. And then for many, many people, you know, when they're accused of crimes or they're accused of things and perhaps they're acquitted, perhaps the charges just get dismissed. In many cases, people aren't receiving so much as a sorry. There's no compensation, right, for many, many people who have just seen incredible acts of violence, who have experienced profound mental health traumas. There's nobody coming to say, oh, I'm sorry for that. There's nobody coming to do that. And so if we're serious about making our communities, envisioning the world in which we want to live in, there's no choice. Everyone has to get involved into really dealing with what's going on in our prisons and what's happening in everyone's name in this city.
So there's several points that you raised there that are really powerful. How do we deal with people who have committed violence? And I think the powerful statement by the public defender, Keisha Hudson, who said that 81% of the individuals that they represent for violent acts have had violent acts committed to them, and that they are traumatized themselves. And so we have a cycle of violence that has occurred from in the prison, being violently treated, then coming out, and you acting out the violence that has been acted upon you, and then you acted upon somebody else. Now they have been traumatized, and now they do something, they're in prison, and now they're even more traumatized. They come back out, and then they victimize somebody else, and a continual cycle, which the prison is a part of that cycle of violence. And so it really means that we have to take a long look at that first 80% that really is about public health and addiction issues. We got to deal with that right away. But then that issue of those who are acting violently, finally get them in facilities in a way that we can begin to treat the trauma that they have dealt with and begin to do some real success to move them out of that traumatized lifestyle and into a more healthy, humane lifestyle that is possible. But until we reduce the system enough and get those other folk that shouldn't be there in the first place until we deal some with so we can help those who are dealing with the violence parts of it. I think we're still going to continue to have this cycle with no way of ending it.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, though, Rev, like it's not the system's responsibility to be accountable to us, because we understand that they brought us here as slaves. Essentially, we are no matter how you slice it and dice it, we're looked at as their property. And so to re-enslave to you get 10 cents an hour to work in prisons across the country or less, right? I think it's our job to actually diagnose ourselves and to come for ourselves. We want to end the violence. We actually need to begin talking, and I'm asking of the faith communities to actually, because that's the difference between the era that we're dealing in now versus the era of maybe say 30, 40, 50 years ago, because the faith communities were more involved in our communities, and so we could turn to the church. Hey, my son is on drugs. Can I get them in a program? Does the faith community even care about? I see churches on almost every other corner, but are these faith communities going into the communities and dealing with the issues? Because what's going to happen is that if I get robbed, I'm not calling Reverend so and so. I'm calling the police, and I don't want to call the police, but who am I going to call? Like, I don't have a recourse to kind of deal with this. And so we're inviting the police state into our communities because we want to feel safe, and we don't have another recourse. And so I'm saying, of course, our taxpayer dollars are going to these, going to the police and the government to protect us and to do the thing that they're supposed to do. But we know, as the original slave catchers, as the original fugitive slave catchers, that these individuals are not going to, they're not going to risk out on the millions or billions of dollar industry that re-enslaving black and brown people is. They're not going to, the judges are not going to miss that check. The politicians are not going to miss that check. These rural communities that don't have anything else going on for themselves are not going to miss those extra prisons that's providing jobs in those communities. They're not going to miss that. They're not going to miss that for us, not for our humanity. So then it's our job to go, because we could have prevented little 15-year-old Johnny from shooting this other kid had we been in his life, because he's only acting out as a symptom of his trauma. He wasn't just born a bad kid, but maybe he was left alone too long. Maybe he wasn't taught right in the school systems that's failing him. Maybe he wasn't, maybe his father had went to jail early. Whatever the case is, it's our job to begin to diagnose those issues first and foremost, because that's our community. We're not going to go and ask somebody else to. We're not going to ask the slave master to come and now fix the issue that you caused. No, they're benefiting too much from us. They're benefiting too much from our labor to address that issue. So I think that it's for us, since we know these issues and we know the symptoms of these issues, that we should begin addressing our communities and not just talking about them, but actually going in and getting them, pulling them up. So that they can see, so that they can begin to diagnose what they actually need. Because me sitting here, although I come from that community, I'm still, in a privileged position per se. And because I can say, oh, this is what's happening, or that thing is the reason that this is happening. And so, but I'm on the outside looking in. The third grader who's being set up for prison based off of standardized testing isn't that aware.
I understand and I hear what you're saying. Let me push back a little bit.
Okay.
I will never accept the government that I pay taxes to, even if what you say is absolutely true, that their framework in thinking about us as always as the individuals who are slaves. I will never accept that as a reality for the government that I'm dealing with. I'm going to fight for the humanity that I have and the humanity of my people. And so, yes, there are those in government that feel that way, but there are those in government who felt that we should all still be on the plantation. Our heritage is one of struggle, or one of fighting, or one of demanding our humanity, no matter what happens, no matter what they continue to do, no matter what the new initiative or the new way they're trying to re-enslave us, we still must assert our humanity. So part of that is where I agree with you we should be using the resources that we have to make sure that we take care of our own. And I will say to you, there's churches that are doing that. We were at one the other night who has a mental health ministry that they take out of their own pocket to deal with the trauma that's going on in that community, because they have made a commitment, whether they ever get a dime from federal government, to make sure that community has all the trauma treatments it needs. And there are churches that do that. And there are a lot of churches that don't, you know. So we need to encourage more of them to do even more of that. But I think we're always in struggle. We're always in struggle. This is a part of our struggle. And I'm gonna still demand our government to do what it's supposed to do for us, whether it hard is to do it or not. And those little towns across the state of Pennsylvania, yes, I'm gonna do everything possible so you don't have what they say is, where are our bodies? It's not your body. It's our people and the life of our people. And we're not made to fill your prisons, and we're gonna fight you with everything we can to make sure that they don't. So I hear you, but I wanna just make sure that this is you check this as a part of the struggle of being in this nation, and the struggle continues.
Agreed. But I think it's both and.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I think it's both
Yes,
and.
I'm agreeing, I guess.
Yeah.
It was more like you wanted to add on some more. You wanted to add on some more.
Maybe so, but yeah, I'm thankful for those like you and who are part of this, continuing to be a part of this continual struggle for justice for all of us, and have dedicated your life to it. You know, it's good when we can come together and share from different perspectives and learn from one another, so we can improve the struggle ourselves, everybody coming together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I just want to highlight a few things as we're beginning to wind down. The Philadelphia jails have not escaped scrutiny from the legal system. We know that the legal system is imperfect. That is the understatement of the century. And they have not escaped scrutiny. There is a class action that has been litigated against the city of Philadelphia and against the commissioner of the Philadelphia Department of Prisons. That lawsuit was settled in April 2022, but what it did was, as a part of that settlement, there was an independent monitor that was appointed that is not under the purview of the city of Philadelphia, is specifically under the purview of the federal judge. In that case is Remick versus City of Philadelphia. And all of the materials related to the public filings are available online if people want to peruse those, that really give a detailed, factual overview of what was alleged to have occurred in the Philadelphia prisons. But what I want to say is, and this is something that the independent monitors specifically brought out in one of their reports, one of their recent reports. It's that the Philadelphia jails are in such a crisis that the staffing numbers, which have increased, approached about 40% under staffing levels, that the Philadelphia jails, in light of the staffing crisis, need to decarcerate by about 800 people. And probably even more in this instance, in order to at least even stabilize, right? And so it's important for all of the institutional actors, right? We've been talking about the prisons here, but it's important for all institutional actors to really understand the court system, the district attorney, the public defender, the private defense bar, the people who work in social services, to understand the real profound harm that is happening at the prisons every time someone is incarcerated, right? And that it is so dire that you even have an independent monitor articulating the need for decarceration, right? That is astounding. And the second thing that the independent monitor said, and again, these are available, these filings are available online as well. The second thing that I think that is really, really important to talk about is, again, there's this profound trauma that's happening every day when someone is incarcerated. there are profound mental health effects. And so we've talked about that a lot here. What the Remick case was interesting. What it did was it really highlighted the issue of lack of out of cell time and how that results in prolonged isolation or solitary confinement. So Sam, I heard you, when you spoke, talk about solitary confinement. So if you could share with our viewers what solitary confinement is and how it's impacting people in the Philadelphia jails, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I feel like the definition of solitary confinement can sometimes be varied, but we often talk about it as 22 to 24 hours a day in a single cell, and you're by yourself. Sometimes the lights are on 24/7, which is a form of torture. It's a military torture tactic, actually, to have the lights on all the time. And there are other things that guards do to really manipulate and really attack people who are in solitary confinement. Maybe not physically, although sometimes that happens as well, but as means of psychological torture. So sometimes they'll bang on the walls or they'll shout really terrible things. One person that we had talked to told guards that he wanted to commit suicide, and they said, go ahead and do it. And so there are all of these terrible, terrible things that are happening when people are in solitary confinement, and you have no meaningful interaction with anyone else. You aren't able to get visitation, like Medusa was saying, have access to phone calls. And oftentimes people don't know why they're there in the first place or when they're going to be able to get out. The Monitor, as Nia was talking about, has named this type of isolated segregation, sometimes indefinite isolated segregation, as one of the most traumatic and harmful parts of the Philly jails.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. And I think it's important for people who are watching, who are maybe not familiar with the court system, who maybe have never gone to a prison, or maybe have gone to a prison or have been incarcerated but are not sure what to do, right? What to do from this point and how to really address these concerns, particularly in light of the current context of Philadelphia, right? The current political landscape, right? And so I'm curious if you can share if there are potential advocacy efforts that people can do, and how people can get involved.
Yeah. And then I know Medusa has some things to share as well. One of the things that we're working on at Abolitionist Law Center and a coalition of many other organizations and people, including Medusa, is a coalition to create a prison oversight board over the Philly jails. And this board would essentially create an independent monitoring system of 9 people who are Philadelphia citizens, including incarcerated people who have been at State Road and their loved ones, to really investigate things like the deaths that are happening in the jail, the inadequate medical care, any form of torture that is happening there, the hygiene supplies that people are getting, any sort of harm and trauma that's happening in the jail. This body will be able to look into that and provide recommendations to change what is happening in the jail. And so if folks are interested in getting involved with that coalition, we always want more people to join. You can you can email me, sam@alcenter.org, and there will be other opportunities to get involved with organizing around what's happening in the jails. And I also just want to say the way that we are going to change things is through people power. You know, we have to work together collectively to change such a horrific system, and we are up against really, really powerful actors. State violence is something that is highly sponsored and favorable, I think, amongst people who are powerful. But that doesn't mean that they have the thousands of people that we have on our side that don't believe that this is right. And so I would say join an organization and get involved in the movement. And there's also a really great event that is coming up soon that Medusa will be hosting.
Yeah, Medusa, if you want to share with people how they can get involved in advocacy efforts and how they can act upon what they've learned.
Yeah, so one thing that you mentioned about the Remick report is, the commissioner herself mentioned that they needed to decarcerate 1,200 people in order to be in compliance. And one of the things that we wanted to focus on is the 300 women in TGNC folks that are in the women's facility. We believe that you can not just decarcerate those folks, but you can also close down the women's jail. It's inadequate. It's not changing anything. It's not keeping people safe. It's not, we don't need it. And so, especially since you're dealing with a staff issue, we want to close the women's jail. We've seen it happen in California. We've seen it happen across the country where folks are closing down the women's jails. And so on December 11th at the Friends Center, between 6 to 8 p.m., we'll be doing a panel discussion. Sam will be joining us, and we're going to talk to some lawyers. We're going to talk to some judges. We're going to talk to some folks on what type of services are available for folks on pretrial. What alternative sentencing can happen in the city of Philadelphia instead of locking people up? What alternative sentencing, what's pre-existing? What can happen? What like we talked about diversionary programs, but also what about any type of preventive, sort of services that can keep people out of jail? And so part of it is that we don't need jails. Jails don't keep you safe. Jails don't make the community safer. It doesn't make life better. You don't become, more advanced as a society because you have jails and prisons. And so we want to see them close the women's Philadelphia's jail. We want to see them close it. And we want to see more people, more cities, more states close their women's facilities and actually deal with the crisis that's actually happening in our communities as opposed to criminalizing folks.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And can you just share a little bit briefly about the Still We Rise Coalition? Yeah,
so the Still We Rise Coalition was initially the Incarcerated Women's Group. Incarcerated Women's Working Group, and it was initially started from the Pennsylvania Prison Society about 30 years ago. So it's been around for a while. We've just transitioned in leadership to empower directly impacted people to kind of be in the forefront and to be at the helm of this sort of work. We show up as the experts of our experience. We believe that through empowering directly impacted women and TGNC folks that we can be the change that we want to see. We can also begin to, show the community which way we need to go around this issue. As someone who is directly impacted, we want to weaponize our experience. We want to humanize that experience first and foremost, so that people know that this is not just some, issue happening to some criminal, but this is actually a human being who actually needs to have these issues addressed in the community at large, and then specifically with women and TGNC folks. And that mass incarceration is not just a male issue. It's not just a man issue. It's a community issue, but it's also a women's issue. It's a juvenile issue. It's a whole community of people being impacted by mass incarceration, and specifically in Philly jails, where we have over 350,000 people impacted by incarceration. That's over 40% of the population in and of itself. So we want people to, one, begin to talk about it and to not feel shamed by that experience, but we also want people to understand that this issue is not happening in isolation.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And as we get ready to close, I want to thank you so much for coming today and the work that you do. And we just want to make sure to continue the conversation.
I would just simply say that for particularly those people who are people of faith, many who are involved in prison ministries, you understand the difficulty what is going on in there now, and you have to be a voice to your public leaders. You have to be a voice to your government about what you have heard here today. It's not enough simply to minister to them, those people in prison. You have to have action to give them what they need, and that means going right to government. So we're calling on you to speak out and speak firm for justice.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, just everyone, for tuning in, and we hope to continue the conversation. It's a long road ahead, but it's incredibly, incredibly important. And so thank you so much, everyone, for coming.